Now, me and you talked about this on the wind-up earlier in the week, but I thought we should at least talk about Sony and the state of PlayStation, because I do think, I guess, do your general thoughts on it. I've got some points I want to get to, but where are you at on PlayStation right now?
It's a hard one, because I look at the games that have released over the past few years, and I've enjoyed every single one of them. I've even loved a few, Returnal, God of War, Ragnarok. I keep wanting to call that Valhalla now,
well,
since
that's
the
what it's called
DLC
right now.
dropped. I almost make the mistake every time. But the point is, I've enjoyed every single thing they put out. I love the PSVR 2 and the games that released alongside that. I've loved their expansion into movies and TV. I really enjoyed The Last of Us. I even thought Uncharted was quite good.
I didn't mind Uncharted at all.
Never saw Gran Turismo in the end, but maybe one day.
They tried to give us it for free. We said no. Give it away from me.
Is that right?
I'm sure they put it on either PS Plus or they put it on some sort of. They did it at the end of last year. It was like, here's some movies for you guys, and everyone's like, just that meme of the puppet looking away, like I'm all right, I'm fine, thank you.
But the point is, even though I've enjoyed everything they've done, I just find they've become a bit boring. I don't think they're in dire straits or anything like that. I do think their push towards live services was a mistake, but it seems like they've rectified that issue. Just when I look at Sony now, I just think like it feels so corporate and it feels so cold. Kind of cold, and it doesn't, that connection with the fans, that they used to have, the edge in their kind of wackier marketing, the bit of personality that they used to have, I think has kind of gone away across the Jim Ryan era. And what we're left with, are exceptional studios and good games. So I don't want to rag on them too much, but the lack of sort of transparency when it comes to, how few reveals or events they do these days and how kind of boring their announcements can often be. We're announcing the PlayStation VR 2 on a blog post. We're talking about PS5 with Wired, but we're not going to show you anything.
No.
Like that, to me, is just, I feel like they can do better in that regard.
Yeah, my thing is like it's not necessarily the promise of next gen, but the suggestion of what a new console generation can bring. Like obviously the leaps between generations are smaller and smaller as we go down the line, but like they've barely capitalized on what the PS5 can do. Like I didn't get a PS5 to play Last of Us 2 again. Like it's just, I know you did, but like it's still that thing of like I don't even know what shows off what this system can do. I got that feeling a bit playing Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty because that DLC is actually geared or made for next gen systems. Like they didn't have to cater to the old gen stuff.
Yeah.
But there are so few games that feel like, oh my god, this was couldn't be done before, or like look at the way I'm controlling this, or like feel the cheese. My mind went to for the Simpsons quote. But still, there's so few things doing that, and I don't necessarily consciously think of that every other week. But when I take a step back and think about the generation, you do think about the Horizons, the God of Wars, like they're solid, but the thing that differentiated the PS5 version of those games was it's a higher resolution or it's a higher frame rate. Yeah. And I want those things, but I thought they would be quality of life improvements, not like the main thing.
And you know what? I do get that. We've definitely talked before about, how the cross-gen approach to the early part of this generation definitely led to that feeling that you described there of, well, where's the thing that I need to buy a PlayStation for? And I just hope that across the next few years we start to see those games. To me, Spider-Man 2 was kind of halfway there. When that game opened, I thought it was going to be the best game I ever played. I know we might have different opinions on this, but that Sandman fight, the scale of that and the way, I know it's been doing the rounds on social media, but when Miles gets thrown across the city and it's so fast and it's so instantaneous, to me there was something about the scale and the detail of the world they had created there. I know a few of the character models looked a little bit dodgy, but there was something about it where I felt like, okay, I can see why I need a PlayStation 5 to play this. But then after that, just despite having some excellent moments that rivaled that intro later on throughout the game, it did kind of slow back down into a familiar rhythm that you maybe associate with the Horizon sequel or the God of War sequel, where it's like, oh, you've given me something fantastic, but now I'm getting a lot of stuff that's kind of familiar and that I could have perhaps experienced on a PlayStation 4.
Yeah, man, I like, after Spider-Man 2, I started sketching out an editorial or a rant or whatever called Sony Make Boring Sequels.
That doesn't sound like you.
I had to tap into it, it's been a while. And I thought Spider-Man 2 very, very polished and everything, but it didn't blow me away. That opening bit, Sai was the one who said it, but she was like, it's the worst part of those games. Like it's so on rails. And I remember thinking when I played through it, I really didn't like how arbitrary the combat felt. But you're fighting these big like mush men. It didn't work for me at all. It didn't work for me or Sai at all. But you absolutely loved it, and obviously you're a big fan as well. For the people that worked for, that was a good showcase of look how much of the city we can load in one go. I definitely got that from the map menu, like the open world map, and that you can pick any point in the map and then just pick where you want to go. And the game has that really cool transition where you sort of like it goes from the graphic into real time, and that's sick. But you barely they don't do anything with it. Like it's other than like you said that bit at the beginning. That's not necessarily the thing I wanted to focus on too much. I think my thoughts on PS5 are that I'm still waiting for you need a PS5 to play X. I'm still waiting for that thing. It's not to say they haven't had really fun games, but it's a weird thing because one of the points that I had down here was the PS5 Pro is meant to be coming this year.
Yeah.
And we do not need that thing.
No, we really don't.
It's the smallest leap between any console.
I know, and that's coming from someone who gobbled up the PS4 Pro like it was a Sunday roast, you know what I mean? Like, I couldn't wait for that thing when it dropped. But this time around, I think because they have, taken that cross-generational approach to the start of this gen, we haven't seen those games like you described. Like, yeah, I can point to a bunch of games that I've loved that are on the PS5 exclusively, and I can say that segment is next gen. We talk about the boss fights in Final Fantasy 16. Yeah. Not a first-party exclusive, but still a PS5 exclusive. Those could not be accomplished in that way on a previous generation. But there's a lot in that game that still could. There's a lot of like moment-to-moment gameplay that didn't feel that next gen or that revolutionary. So yeah, when it comes to the PlayStation 4 Pro, PlayStation 5 Pro, sorry, I think what would I be getting this for? I don't have an 8K television.
Another thing is
I always prioritize quality modes anyway. Will it give me a slight frame rate boost? Like, what am I going to buy this for? I bought a PS4 Pro so I could get the best version of The Last of Us Part 2.
Right.
What am I buying the PlayStation 5 Pro to kind of future-proof myself for? That's my question at this moment in time.
Yeah, and it's like I remember when they started rolling out the marketing for the PS4 Pro, where it was all they had like Todd Howard and all these various developers saying, we need this power, like we're waiting to take advantage of this thing. And obviously the last generation was so like immediately hobbled by all these, like Watch Dogs was like a state, Assassin's Creed Unity was a state. It was the buggy, glitchy generation, and it was like, if only we had more tech, it would solve everything. And then obviously that came out, it didn't solve anything. Even last year, you had all those ridiculously broken games, like even like Redfall or Kong Skull Island or whatever it is. I think the bar of quality is like it's more of a spiky line. Like it's just there's an assumption that you're getting either a broken product or a not polished finished product. Most people don't buy day one, and it's that general conversation on like you might as well wait. There'll be a Game of the Year version. Jedi Survivor. I went back to that over the Christmas holidays because I can finally play a finished performance version. It took 7 months for them to get that thing done. Like that's really insane.
It is. It absolutely is. And I know we said we were going to move on from like almost the graphical debate, but what kind of sums up the position of the PlayStation 5 at the moment in time and whether or not we need a PS5 Pro is you look at The Last of Us Part 2 running on PlayStation 4. It still looks unbelievable. It got that update for the PS5 anyway that I think ups the frame rate and the resolution a little bit. And you look at side-by-sides of screenshots from the original version and the remastered version on the PS5, and the differences are so minor. Whereas you jump back a generation and you look at the differences between the original Last of Us on the PS3 and the remaster that came out on the PS4, and it's such a bigger jump, and that's kind of those smaller discrepancies and those smaller margins now to me makes me wonder who's going to buy a PS5 Pro who already owns a PS5. It might be an excellent thing for people who have been waiting to jump on the next gen train, but like, who is this for? Is it for those newcomers, or is it being sold to me and you?
I think they're still doing the like how do we get the console audience to be more in line with the PC mentality of like we might as well sell you the half-step system because we're working on the chipsets anyway. And in years gone by and generations gone by, shorter generations we would just put the next system out, and it's like we might as well just do a PS5 Pro with the new chipsets in. And obviously we've learned how to make the hardware a bit smaller. Even the new revision of the PS5, the basic shell of the existing system is a a bit smaller.
Yeah.
And it's like tech always gets smaller over time. So I think they're just learning to monetize that stuff a bit more. And the PS4 Pro was the experiment, and then it sold well enough that they were like, we might as well do this.
Yeah.
And then do a PS6 in another few years. I was going to mention games though. PS5 Pro, I think I said before, but it's penciled in for holiday 2024. So it'll be towards the end of the year, September, November. Sony have just got a nothing slate though.
Yeah.
Like for this, yeah. Like you've got Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which has an exclusivity window of 3 months, which is I don't know what the hell they're doing with Square Enix.
Is that only 3 months, is it?
Apparently,
it's
yeah.
interesting.
But the thing is, like, they're so shady with it because, like, Final Fantasy VII Remake from 2020 still hasn't got an Xbox release date. No. And but they had initial marketing materials and conversations around it coming to Xbox back then, and then it just is this PlayStation franchise. And like 16 was exclusive, and it's like, I don't know what those conversations are. And it's like, I don't know how that benefits Square Enix, a company that aren't doing that well. Like, they're doing okay, but there was a whole thing about how Final Fantasy VII Remake, like, saved them from almost bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Like, they would be better to put their games on multiple platforms again.
It would, but even when they do that, they always complain, man. They always talk about how all of their games, no matter what console they release on, comes in under expectations.
Yeah.
They're never happy with anything.
No.
They just can't. I don't know why they're in the video game business in a way, to be honest, because they're never happy. They have outlandish expectations for the games that they're actually making. So I wonder whether they keep turning to Sony just to get some guaranteed money in to help fund the development to offset those underwhelming in their eyes revenues from those games that they always seem to harp on about. I don't know.
Well, the thing is, like, the overall thing is that, like, exclusives don't necessarily matter as much as we would want them to, or I would want them to. Because if you look at the PS5 exclusives that are listed for the rest of the year, you've got Helldivers 2, Foam Stars. Helldivers is the one from the studio that they acquired, but like Foam Stars is, I think that is a Square Enix game anyway.
It is, yeah.
So it's like third parties are kind of bailing them out. The other games they've got down are Rise of the Ronin, Death Stranding 2, and Final Fantasy. They don't have, other than the live service stuff, they don't have any first party games, you know, on the docket, and they haven't had for a while. I think internally in my head that's because they bet so much on the live service stuff and the reception to that was so negative. But because of how protracted game development is, if you're walking something back, it's like 2-3 years of a certain development that needs to be walked back, and it'll take that again to get a whole bunch of single player projects back in the works. Like,
it's true.
I think this year is a stopgap year, and I think if they do a PS5 Pro, there'll be very little to show it off.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. But I don't know, man. I agree, and I also...
Like, the console sales is sky high.
Yeah.
We'll talk about them when we get to Xbox stuff, or more about when we get to Xbox stuff, but like, they are by far the market leader.
Absolutely. I said this in the podcast the other day, but I do think they can have a quieter year. To me, if they do release the games that you've mentioned there, Death Stranding 2, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and then the likes of Helldivers and Foam Stars and maybe a few other things across the year that we might not know about, I think that's decent. And I think it makes sense that even if they didn't can all of those live service games and they haven't pivoted away from the likes of the Last of Us factions, we probably would have been in for a quieter year anyway, in my eyes, because... Again, like I said in the podcast the other day, I think we've had a decent start to the generation, way better than we had in the PS4 era in terms of first-party exclusives. You know, we came out the gate with the likes of Demon's Souls and Returnal and Horizon and God of War, and we've got remakes for The Last of Us and whatnot. We've had a pretty decent first-party slate, and I look at the studios that have put out games, you know, obviously Spider-Man 2 as well and Spider-Man Miles Morales. I look at the studios that have put out games, Insomniac, Naughty Dog, Sony Santa Monica, bloody a bunch of them is my point.
Yes.
And I think they would have needed to cook anyway. You know, like they probably wouldn't have had a game ready anyway. Like Naughty Dog single player game maybe would have came out this year if they were all focusing on it. But it's a big maybe is what I'm saying. So
the thing is, like, the potential shadow drop would be a Ghost of Tsushima or whatever the follow up to that is, like whatever Sucker Punch's next project is. It's just that there was so many. I mentioned internal before, but it was like there were so many reports coming out about Sony, the work culture at Sony, and like the conversation around layoffs and all that kind of stuff on the Insomniac side. And it was like, if the Spider-Man studio is struggling, what the hell are you guys doing?
No, that is true, and you know, again, I'm not cutting Sony any slack here because that stuff absolutely sucks. That is like so across the industry right now, and it makes me worry about the industry. You know, if like you're saying, the biggest Sony, the market leaders, the biggest companies like Sony, you know, the market leaders who have these huge franchises and huge licenses, if they're worried about the margins, like, that can't be healthy for the entire industry. You know, if they're worried that Spider-Man 2 won't make enough money despite the original game selling 20 million copies, and they might have to lay people off. Like, that's a dreadful environment to cultivate, in my opinion. And it absolutely sucks for the passionate, talented people who are, like we mentioned the other day, you know, on the ground, putting their blood, sweat, and tears into these games to not only make good games, but games that sell really well. The only issue is they aren't selling, quote unquote, enough for the people in charge.
Yeah, and to that end, like the likes of the Spider-Man with Insomniac, and the amount of Marvel titles that are now on the slate for them, and the amount of money that's tied up in those deals. Like, Spider-Man's development cost was like 360 million or something.
It's
some ludicrous amount. Excuse me, some ludicrous amount that you know, ultimately I would have to imagine goes into, it was all the license fee. Like, I imagine that if you're Marvel and you're trying to get on top of a slate of characters rolling out, Spider-Man is your boy, and I think that was probably the amount that would have made that go so high, because the likes of Baldur's Gate was a lot less. You know, I keep saying I would much prefer Insomniac did 10 smaller titles than what we now know they are going to be doing, whether it be X-Men or more Spider-Man games. There's the Spider-Man multiplayer game, like the multiverse game, or Spider-Verse game. That stuff, like the amount that then needs to make back, I just feel like it doesn't make sense. And it reminds me of the Sean Layden conversation, who was obviously an ex-head of Sony PlayStation, talking about how everything is unsustainable. This road that we're on is unsustainable. And I wonder who's going to break first in terms of like walking stuff back and not making so many humongous bets over and over again.
Square Enix, it goes back to what we were just saying, you know, that's probably part of the reason why they're relying on other people to get funding for their own games, because, you know, they're disappointed with the sales of everything they put out. Like, at a certain point, like, that level of production, you know, competing with the most graphically impressive, most feature-rich games, like, kind of becomes a losing game. We've seen that in the movie space, I think, over the past few years, especially. You know, suddenly Marvel, which was once the most bankable franchise in the world, suddenly that starts losing money, and it's spending $300 million on every movie that it puts out, and it can no longer justify those price points. So then you start seeing movies shift around. You start seeing movies and television shows get cancelled, and it's not just them. It's industry-wide, you know. Movies come out, they don't make quite as much, you know. Something might make $700 million, but because it cost $300 before marketing, it barely makes a profit. It might even lose money, you know, and that kind of high-level risk is so prevalent now that, like John Layden was saying, you know, that isn't sustainable for everything. It can be for maybe one blockbuster a year, but not for not if it's the model for the entire industry. Yeah,
and that was the thing with Spidey, was like, because it had this astronomical development budget, it had to sell like 7 or 8 million to try and to even break even. And like that would, I think the launch sales were about 2 or 3 million in the first weekend. And whether that, they haven't reported on it since then. So it's like, you would assume that makes sense. But it's just such a weird industry, like you said before, about the industry itself is maybe the issue, where, you know, the fact that the Spider-Man studio are struggling. Like, imagine working on Spider-Man, you get it over the finish line, and then just before Christmas you're told, actually no, we're actually going to have some layoffs, have conversations about layoffs that are down the line, which was indicative of 2023 overall. And it's a wider industry thing, and not just the console manufacturers, but the amount of people that have lost their jobs in the industry is over 10,000 now, which is ludicrous.
Well, yeah.
I did see, I think it was either Jason Schreier over at Bloomberg or maybe like a Kotaku write-up saying, sorry, it was Polygon, I think, saying the 2022's layoffs were also sky high. It's just that it wasn't as much in the conversation. 2023 is definitely higher, but it is an overall issue with the industry.
Yeah, man.
A lot of it is coming out of the pandemic. A lot of bets that were made in the pandemic based around the amount of time people had to play games that clearly wasn't going to sustain once people started, once that, you know, was mostly over.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, everyone was saying it around the time of the Game Awards, where, you know, people like us, a lot of people were saying, you know, 2023 was a great year for games, and it absolutely was. You know, like the games that came out were of such a, in my opinion, high quality, and there was often one every month that everyone was talking about or clamoring to play. But at the same time, it was a dreadful time for the games industry, because the people who were making those games felt like they were getting shafted more than ever with all of these layoffs and with these precarious kind of working conditions within the studios, despite them working on successful big games. And it's, it goes back to that question of across the companies, how long can that continue, especially when these companies, Sony included, admittedly to a lesser degree than some of the competition, are gobbling up studios and then not really knowing what to do with them. You know, we saw the Embracer fiasco last year where they had a couple $1 billion deal fall through. And it meant that all the studios that they bought, you know, in some cases, iconic studios working on iconic franchises just got shuttered. So they bought them to shut them down. And I don't think Microsoft necessarily will be in that position because they have way more of a financial cushion, but they have bought so many studios. At what point? I mean, they made loads of layoffs last year as well. At what point did they look at those studios and say, we might have overdone it here, let's shut a few of those down? EA did it in the 2000s. You know, they gobbled up a bunch of studios.
My beloved Bullfrog did not
Exactly.
make it.
Visceral Games, among many others. And I kind of just worry about that kind of acquisition spree that some companies are on, and it seems like a good idea in the short term, but long term, how can you sustain all of those studios with the margins that you currently have?
Yeah, and it's like we're already seeing that crumble, like especially across 2023.